So, dear colleagues, we shall start now. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you here to this panel discussion. My name is Anton Kulbachevsky. I am the head of the Department of Nature Management and Environmental Protection of Moscow. We will be talking about maintaining and multiplying and about the ecological dominance of sustainable development. Right now, the world is changing the aims of urban development. The strategies are shifting, and by now, at the forefront, we are seeing the ecological dominance as city sustainability. Moscow and other largest megalopolises are committing to sustainable development, and we will discuss the strategies of leading megalopolises in the world and what tools are being used, what measures are being taken, and what technology allow to increase the quality of the environment and to reverse the ecological situation. I'm happy to introduce Irina Ilyina, the professor, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Director of the Institute of Regional Studies and Urban Planning at the Higher School of Economics. She will be co-moderating. And now, Irina, you have the floor. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm happy to see you at this event. And the most important thing is we will be talking about maintaining and multiplying. In the 21st century, the whole world is puzzled with how to maintain the ecological stability of the environment. Recently, at the forum in Quito, October last year, what was discussed was urban development in 21st century, and there were 5 main principles suggested that articulate the goals of urban development in this long horizon. And if you look at those 5 priorities, you will see that each of them has an ecological component. First principle is transforming the methods of planning and forecasting and city planning, introducing the element of sustainability and eco-safety. The following principle is developing an ecological function of the city, because cities are very densely packed with people, and it is important that people live comfortably, conveniently, in terms of ecology too. Well, the next priority that was articulated in Quito was engaging citizens in urban planning, in urban development and urban management. We know that our citizens are actively engaged in forming public spaces, and there is a focus on environmental protection. The next principle that was articulated in Quito was resource and energy efficiency. Indeed, cities that by now accumulate the largest populations are very actively consuming resources and energy, and they are facing an extremely important task to save those resources. And the last priority articulated in Quito was protecting and maintaining ecosystems, and I'm happy that we have here such guests who have enormous expertise in this field and will be talking to us about the main challenges that the humanity is facing while forming those ecological dominance of urban development. Irina, thank you. We will discuss the ecological trends. The summer of this year really shows that climate is shifting, and Muscovites are seeing that with their own eyes. Those torrential rains, fires, forest fires in Portugal. There are challenges to be solved. How do we reduce ecological and financial costs? Well, that question I will address to our dear guest, laureate, Peace Nobel Prize award, Riccardo Valentini. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I think I need the slides, so don't know if you can put some nice representation on. Yes, indeed. I mean, we are today facing one of the major challenges of our human development is how we really going to rethink our society under a certain number of pressures. One is climate change, the other is population growth, food security, water shortage. So that's really the moment where innovation, science, creative thinking, diverse thinking sometimes is very important. I like to start basically from one concern that was already mentioned by Irina before, that is how to maintain ecosystem services. This is really important when we look at urban planning, and should I point like this? Point like this? Next slide, please. It doesn't work. Okay. And particularly when we are looking today at the urban population, that is very popular graph, growing at a very high rate. Probably in 2050 we have 80% people living in urban areas. But not only that, but it's the ratio between urban and rural population that makes things a little bit more challenging, because less and less people will live in rural areas. And so, for example, food production and how we maintain food services in urban areas is becoming a big challenge, because everybody will live in metropolitan areas. And the next slide. And of course, when we convert natural land or into urban lands, we lose a lot of services, like, for example, production services like food, or regulating services like, for example, cleaning the air, water regulation, carbon sequestration by forests and plants, and also sometimes also cultural landscapes that we change dramatically with our, let's say, vision of a urban city that sometimes is contrasting with our heritage. Next slide. So I think that's really the time where we have to think multidisciplinarily, look at the holistic vision of the urban development, take into account different services that are important to maintain for the health of our citizens. So not only roads, of course, mobility is very important, but energy distribution, but in particular the natural service like green infrastructure. For example, the European Union has a very important directive on green infrastructure in this moment, and it's something that we are looking forward, but we have to find also solutions that are practical, viable, and they're also economically sustainable. So I want just to mention two things of these services. Next slide, please. First one is how much carbon we sequester by forests, by plants, in urban areas. And that's an interesting study that we've done in urban parks in Rome. And because, of course, as you know, the cities are one of the major elements of greenhouse gas emissions. 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by urban areas, and they will grow. So there is a way to recirculate this carbon dioxide, there is a way to accumulate, and one of the services that did carbon sequestration, you can see that quite huge number, between 660 tons of CO2 per hectare up to 1,000 almost tons per hectare can be sequestered by urban parks. And if we convert this into a carbon value, that is a carbon market with different, of course, prices, but we take an average price of the voluntary carbon market, it's in the order of 3,000 to 4,000 euro per year, per hectare. That's an interesting value that sometimes municipalities don't consider because they don't see this economic value in the park. Second example, slide please. It's about the water resources, and this now there are growing literature in which we can show the importance, advantages of green infrastructure in reducing runoff. There was mentioned before from the director the problem of floods and storms and how urban areas are becoming impermeable to water, and so we need really to reduce this risk of runoff. At the same time, also infiltration into the soil, that is also important for recharging the water tables. So again, another service that we are really absolutely to maintain, we have to really put in our planning. Next, please. And finally, I think today there is also smart technologies. I want to dedicate just 2 minutes, or 1 minute, if you allow me, on how we really are going to monitor trees in urban areas, and particularly looking at their health status, functionality, water transport, and finally this is a new technology that some people in my lab has developed. It's based on Internet of Things, so it's very smart and very low cost. It's 100 euro per piece, per device, that can monitor the water transfer in the trees, the health status of the leaves, and also the diameter growth. And so as well, it can also show important properties and how to maintain these trees. Next slide. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, I think that it's also important to consider farming system in urban areas. So that's for the point that we need to have more food security. This is an example that I learned from New Moscow City. There is this company, there's a small farm that is in the middle of the urbanization. They're thinking to adapt their farming system, like milk production, into something that can be also urban in some way, so hosting people, providing space, but at the same time having some production. I learned that this is an important, I know the Ruden University is working on studying this plan, and I think it's an interesting way to maintain farming system inside the urban area. Next, please, thanks. And okay, this was a little bit mixing. It was the device that I was showing before. The next one, I think is more interesting. If the next slide, please. Yes, and sorry to go a little bit back. This device is also important for security. There is a gyroscope that measures the stability of the trees and can tell you before if the tree is going to move and in which direction it's moving. And this, again, is really very cheap. It's in the order of $50 and can be put in many thousands of trees and to be monitored for tree security. So I think this type of technology, smart technology, is also important to combine with our green infrastructure. I think it's the last slide, I guess. Thank you. Yes, and this is the way where you can find this information right into this small spin-off university company that works on this device. So thank you. Sorry for mixing up. So some slides have been mixed up, but I think the concept was clear. Thank you. Bye.
Да, спасибо большое, доктор.
Dr. Valentini, thanks a lot for your interesting presentation. Well, really, in your presentation, though briefly, you pinpoint major trends of global development, of urban development everywhere in the world, reflecting the problematic points at the current stage of urban development. And we would like to hear the position of our experts, particularly analytical expert center of the Russian Federation government, Evgeny Agashov. How do you consider the issues of sustainable development of the cities, and what are the priorities for you in terms of energy efficiency? Thanks. Thank you. Well, sometimes as we look at our city where we have lived for a long time, it seems that it's noisy and dirty and difficult to compare with other cities. Well, we lived here in 2006 during hard winters and a very hot summer 2010. Well, some years passed, and what are the changes? Well, and how could you measure them and assess in terms of figures and technically? If we look at the presentation, we can see that last year we promised Julia Lopez, who came and told what CSOR are doing, and we can tell now what Moscow is doing. Please show the next slide, and I guess it's a lot of energy and but twice as much in terms of energy consumption, and we cannot say that Moscow consumes a lot of electrical energy. And what happened during this period? Well, we have to try to compare Moscow with other cities, and this comparison to see it, let us have a look at the next slide. Well, next slide, please. Well, yes. Well, the axis, well, horizontal, you can see the intensive nature of winter for engineers, and the vertical is the population number. And you can see Moscow occupies a huge square, and it intakes old, cold European capitals, Scandinavia, plus 7 cold cities of Canada, and there is a place left for Berlin. Well, actually, Moscow, in terms of energy, incorporates all these megapolises. And what is the energy efficiency of this city? As we say that the power plants of Moscow with a lot of evaporation and steam, well, they are an element of a sophisticated technogenic landscape.
Экономит 30% топлива, 27-30% топлива. Если мы вспомним предыдущий слайд, то мы увидим, что это означает, что 27-30% населения Москвы живет в безуглеродном городе. Это означает, что все, практически 30%, а это одновременно...
Practically 30%, Copenhagen and Stockholm and Helsinki and Moscow, well, they are 3 million people as carbon-free city. Well, 30% of population live in carbon-free area. And another feature is of Moscow is a thermoelectrical schedule. As soon as we have colds, besides heating, we have electrical consumption high, and electrical power is very important. Well, we remember the summer of 2010 with the growth of power consumption because it was very hot. But nevertheless, analyzing the comprehensive efficiency of the city, we can say that in the past 8-10 years, enormous things have taken place. Well, energy saving does take place. We have replaced some energy sources and energy production facilities, well, thermal electrical facilities, networks, a lot of capital repair and a lot of reconstruction of the facilities. On all these effects, small pieces, small contributions and alterations resulted in a very big effect, and more than we had forecasted in our program of energy saving. Speaking about the energy consumption in Moscow, you can see and the city is developing. The emission volume has reduced and 75% reduced. Water consumption is lower, and the city is still growing, becoming more beautiful day by day, and we see that these changes are irrevocable. And next slide shows you we can share the world community, urban community, our methods and best practices, and Ricardo said about holistic approach, and this comprehensive holistic approach here in Moscow helps us to improve some parameters, and we reached very good results. And speaking about the contribution of different ways and methods of realization of this comprehensive holistic approach, they lie in that we update the energy system and networks and buildings and facilities, and what is more important, we talk to people and saying that it's important, it's popular, it's fashionable, it's trendy after all, and the situation changes. And last thing I wanted to say, speaking about sustainable development, we can say it about science academic conferences, and we tell each other about things happening in our cities, and we people believe it because we sincerely believe it. But we cannot tell those guys about sustainable development, but they come back to the cities, and we see that fishes come back to our rivers, and squirrels are very insolent in our forests and parks. Well, they fight over food with the sparrows and some other birds, which means that we are ecologically safer. Well, And it's a very important parameter. And we would like that the number, variety of flora and fauna in our cities would be one of the most important symbols that is happening. Julia is smiling. I think she will add something more. Well, Professor Tilichenko, director, president of Building Institute. You have your institute near the natural reserve, the Elk Island, and you know the situation better. Evgeny Gennadievich, thank you for this informative speech, recalling the animals that come back to our parks, well, assessing the risks that might arise in our urban economy, well, it's obvious, well, and Ricardo also paid attention. And Ricardo also said, emphasized this aspect. And, well, really, over the past 7-8 years, we managed, in terms of sustainable development, to achieve certain good figures, but the solutions were used and best practices of some other megapolises, Thesaurus, and we receive this information on a regular basis. We improved the atmosphere parameters and the water, and apart from traditional methods are not eternal, because the population is growing, the car pool is growing, the load is growing, and here the new technologies is our saving magic wand. It will help us in the future. Without it, we will stop and we'll go and we will go down. Well, we are like in Moscow because, well, we still can improve the situation using traditional methods, well, the greenery and the quality of atmosphere. And I can give the floor to my colleague, closest ally, Julia Lopez-Ventura, that will acquaint us with the key problems of megapolises that are members of Association of Thesaura, and technologies and solutions and best practices. Well, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kubachevsky. I think that, Mr. Gashu, after your energetic speech, what can I add? My name is, as Mr. Kubachevsky just explained, my name is Julia Lopez-Ventura. I am the European Regional Director for C40. C40 is a network of megacities committed to combat climate change. Right now, no, I have no slides, just no slides. So C40 is a network of megacities. Megacities, according to the United Nations definition, are urban agglomerations of 3 million or more inhabitants. So why do we work with these big cities, with these urban agglomerations? Because our network has an ultimate goal, which is to combat climate change. And climate change can be best and more effectively combated in big urban agglomerations, because these are the spaces that have more space to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So my question was about, the question that the organizers and our two co-moderators have asked me is about the 3 main problems that large cities are facing. And I'm very, very pleased that during the opening speech that great Mayor Sobyanin and Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Kozak used during the opening plenary are also what we have detected by working with these 91 megacities in the world. By the way, Moscow is one of the 19 cities part of C40 in the European region. So this is why Mr. Anton Kubachevsky and myself, we have been working very well these last years. So now going back to the point, and our co-moderators have asked me to be brief. I will do my best, and I would like to please them. The number one key problem when working with large metropolis is, of course, the pressure of growing population. Population of cities grows. This has already been mentioned by my colleagues in this session, as I said, by Mayor Sobyanin and Deputy Prime Minister Kozak. Also, resources do not grow at the same pace. Population grows, the increase in services demand growth, and we need to decouple this growth from the intense use of natural resources. This is one of the objectives that we tackle when working with these 91 megacities in the world. The second main problem that we consider the main large cities in the world share is the need to work on inclusive climate action. And I'm very, very pleased that during the opening speech, this has been also a topic that has been covered. You might know the Oxfam report, An Economy for the 1%, that says that the richest 1% now have more wealth than the rest of the world combined. This is really astonishing. This report also shows that 62 people, by the way, 53 of these 62 are men, own the same as half of the world. This is really something astonishing. So we urge our mayors, the mayors of the cities that we work with, but also all the other mayors in the world. I will go on, and if you don't hear me, just let me know. So cities, the mayors in these cities, they need to work also to ensure that the benefits of climate action, of all types of social action, but especially climate action, also reach all citizens, and that the resources are better distributed, which in turn will help them to make the cities more wealthy, more healthy, more safe, more livable, and more resilient. I'm sure that my colleague, Mrs. Seville, will have something to say about this. And finally, the third problem that all large cities, according to our criteria, share is the need that cities need, when combating climate change, cities need to work on both parts of the story. They need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but they also need to adapt to climate change effects. And I'm very happy that Dr. Valentini has shown the slides about the rural and urban environment and the difference, because according to our studies, according to the conversations that we have with these 91 megacities, 70% of these 91 megacities are now already experiencing climate change effects. Which are these climate change effects? We are talking about sea level rise, but maybe not here in Moscow, but yes, in the coastal cities. We are talking about droughts, we're talking about flooding, we're talking about water scarcity, and this is what Dr. Valentini was showing in his slide. So these cities are really struggling to solve growing issues of inequality, but also as climate change is growing, they also need to tackle these problems. So this is the analysis of the three big problems that we have detected in the large megacities. I could continue talking about the solutions that we are working together with our large cities, but I will stop here and I will finalize by inviting you all to please join another C40 speech at 3 p.m. in the plenary room, where my colleague, Mr. Simon Hansen, who is sitting right here in front of me, will talk about Deadline 2020. What is Deadline 2020? So Deadline 2020 is a program, the pathway that we will start working with our cities to ensure that in the next 4 years to come, all the 91 cities in C40, but hopefully inspiring also other cities in Russia and the world, really comply with the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Спасибо большое, Джулия.
Julia, thank you a lot for this good presentation.
В России
Let me remind you that Moscow is the only Russian city that is a part of C40. We invite other Russian cities to join to repeat our experience. This is a very productive thing, and in real time we do receive solutions of various problems in transportation, in infrastructure, and in various other fields. So we get the experience of London, Paris, New York, Beijing. And now I give the floor to Irina again. Yes, I would like to thank Julia for her presentation. She was very brief and very concise in talking about the main points of energy efficiency in energy consumption in major cities. It is extremely important for Moscow this year, because this year we have a year of climate change, or of shifting climates, and it's a nice way to introduce the new events that will be held by Nature Management Department of Moscow. We invite you to take part in those events that we will organize. And now, dear colleagues, I will give the floor to the leading scientific member of a resilient organization, Eric Sevilla, co-supervisor and lead researcher in Resilient Organization. Please, how do you define those critical points in urban development? Tell us, how do you define those points where something goes beyond the benchmark, a certain limit, and how does it affect the ecosystem development and evolution? You have been working in this field for a long time, so you know that this topic is very relevant for Russia and for Moscow specifically. So your experience is extremely valuable for us. Could you share it with us?
I want to share with you the way in New Zealand we have been taking an ecosystems perspective to looking at an urban economy. When you think of an economy, there are many players in the economy: private sector, public sector, and NGO organizations. All of these organizations cooperate together, they compete together, and if you think of a supply chain, it's a bit like a food chain within an ecosystem. So one of the reasons we've been taking an ecosystems perspective to an urban economy is to try and understand how that economy will perform when it is put under severe stress or adversity. And because normally our economic models model an economy during normal times very well, we do not at the moment have very good tools for modeling an economy when it is put under severe pressure. So we focus on resilience. If I can go to the next slide. What we mean by resilience within New Zealand. Next slide. What we mean by resilience in New Zealand, it will come up eventually, is the ability to survive a crisis, but survival is not sufficient for resilience. Resilience also requires that we have a capability to thrive in a world of uncertainty and change. And when we think about our future, uncertainty and change are not likely to slow down. Therefore, resilience is a strategic capability that we need to build into our organizations and our cities. The next slide. So I want to show you an example of how we're taking an ecosystems perspective to help us understand the resilience of urban economies. So this is a photo of Wellington, New Zealand's capital city, and the red line going right through the centre of that city is a major fault line, where recovery is not necessarily a given. Wellington may not be the same after an event of this magnitude. If we can go to the next slide. And the reason for this is because the level of disruption may potentially take Wellington beyond certain tipping points or thresholds within the ecosystem from which it may not recover. If you think of an ecosystem, often it can absorb and adapt to stress. But once a threshold or a tipping point is reached, not have water for up to 3 months, and parts of the city may be completely isolated. The next slide, please. So what we are doing is looking at the urban economy as a system, and I'm trying to understand what are the tipping points or thresholds that could change Wellington from being able to recover from this disruption to not being able to. So we're trying to understand what are the things that might make people tip out of the city. What do they need to be able to stay within the region following a major earthquake like that? And it's not just having habitable houses and running water, it's also timeframes for getting schools and key community services back up and operating for them to want to stay within the region. The next slide, please. We're also looking at what makes businesses want to potentially stay within the region that might take decades to be able to recover. So what are the tipping points or thresholds within the system that might make businesses suddenly flee from the region? The next slide, please. What this ecosystems perspective on the economy has made us recognize is that there are keystone species within any urban ecosystem from an economical perspective. And a keystone species is really a species whose presence has a significant influence on the structure of that ecosystem. So if you take them out, then the rest of the ecosystem suffers. The next slide, please. And for Wellington, that keystone species that we have identified is our central government. So Wellington, being our capital city, has a large proportion of government departments, a large proportion of the population is employed by the government. But that is not the only role that government plays within this ecosystem. If the government chooses to relocate temporarily or permanently from Wellington after the earthquake, then it will pull many other businesses with it. You think of all of the lawyers, the professional services firms, the IT companies will leave Wellington with the government. And so therefore, it means that we need to think about how we can retain government within Wellington after an event. They are the keystone species. If they will stay, then we can potentially maintain that Wellington economy and it will recover. Next slide, please. We also need to think about the resilience of the organizations within our economy and how adaptive, how agile, things that enable them to adapt and be agile. And it comes down to an organization's leadership and culture, the networks and relationships that an organization fosters that it can rely on in times of adversity, and how the organization is strategically positioned to be change ready. So in New Zealand, there is a large effort going on at the moment to look at our government organisations and our private sector organisations and to build their resilience, to build their capacity to capture opportunities that come from change and to be able to thrive in conditions of adversity. The next slide, please. So for Moscow, some of our learnings that we have taken in New Zealand that might be relevant to you. A key question is for Moscow, who or what are your keystone species? Do you know what they are? And if once you've identified what are your keystone species, how resilient are they? How ready to continue functioning in the face of adversity are they? Also thinking about for Moscow, what are your tipping points and thresholds whereby Moscow may not be able to recover from adversity, and how effectively are you embedding those in your planning? Unless we know where those tipping points and thresholds are, you may potentially be measuring the wrong things because it is non-linear. You can be getting very close to the edge of the cliff and not know it until you have fallen off. So it's worthwhile thinking about Moscow's economy as an ecosystem and trying to understand the dynamics and the flow in that ecosystem so that you can manage it effectively from a systems perspective. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Эрика.
Well, thank you, Erika. This year I have visited your country for the first time and I was really pleased. And I'd like to say that I was very impressed. We have a lot to learn. Moscow has a lot to learn from New Zealand. Indeed, it's true, and we are now applying the ecosystem approach as much as we can. And so we have this understanding now, and we will move forward. Well, not in every megalopolis we have 480 species of birds, plants, animals, etc. under protection. We keep track of certain indices, parameters. We track the populations of those animals and plants. This is not a systematic thing yet, but we are really hoping it will be over time. And the main thing, I suppose, that was already mentioned is the economy, green technologies. And I will read out I will introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker is the president of the National Construction University, deputy of the Moscow State Duma, first vice president of the Russian Academy of Architecture and Construction Sciences, vice president of the Russian Union of Constructors, PhD in technical sciences, Valery Telichenko, who will tell us about Russian experience in green technologies and their place in the future. Hello, dear colleagues. I would like to touch upon the topic that we are now hearing about more and more. It's the green. You know, the word green, we hear it all the time. Some say it's just a buzzword, others say it's like the foundation, the most relevant term. But you see that by now this term, this notion, the understanding is very vague. What does green mean? And it is important to discuss, to suggest new meanings, new understandings. Well, I would like to draw your attention not to the notion of green in general, but to the fact that this word, when it's applied to technology, the understanding of the meaning of green often is used as a key element of the sustainable development notion. So being green is about being sustainable. The notion of environment is also quite vague. Living environment. If you look it up in encyclopedias or dictionaries, you will see very concise or very vague descriptions. So you see the notion of living environment, green living environment. Well, it's important. You see, often this notion acts on the premises that construction is one of the key elements of creating this built environment or this living environment. And in our strategic plan, Moscow's strategic plan, what we have, our goal is not to just build, construct housing, square meters or construction materials. No, we aim to create a safe and convenient, comfortable environment. That is how the Ministry of Construction and Energy sees its task. Well, I think that introducing those notions into official documents that determine policies, it's extremely important. So this strategy is in accordance with the European strategy that has been determined and that has formulated a number of important tasks. Let me give you a couple of examples. By 2030, they want to achieve a reduction by 30% of energy consumption, to reduce by 40% construction industry waste, and to have new construction materials that would create no ecological footprint whatsoever. So what we have is in accordance with this green trend.
Green technologies, but in general, how to assess? A lot of ask how to determine that this technology or the product is green. Visually it's impossible to assess and determine. Therefore, you need criteria, parameters that will say, yes, this technology is about green. And we suggest the following parameters. First is energy efficiency. Not energy saving, but energy efficiency, correct consumption of energies. Number two, safety. Safety of the environment of life activity, of that environment where life activity takes place, both internal and external, because most of the time people are inside offices and homes, and this interior should be safer like the exterior, the environment. Next notion is comfort. any human being will aspire for comfort because it's psychological state, and any hindrance, any obstacle, well, is harmful to human beings. And everything that belongs to human technologies must include the notion of comfort. And number 4 is waste. This is what is problem number 2. Concern number 2 of humankind, of Moscow, of Russia, other countries. All this waste is to be reduced and better management. Well, just 1%, 99% is to be processed, 99% of waste, and only 1% can be buried in different fields. It's to the problem of one big dump near Moscow, and the major goal is wasteless technology. And if we looking at these positions, we can assess them in terms of quality and quantity, and then we can provide analysis and assessment of these technologies, how green they are. But green, I would say, it's a romantic term and very simple. But green, it's about strategy, what we are striving for at this stage of humankind. Our human thought, and therefore to set these parameters and criteria, I guess of course we need serious documents and plans. Last year the Russian standard system introduced the technical committee 306, named Green Technologies for Life Activity and Life Production, jointly produced with our university and corporation Rosnano. And it's our first 12 months of joint work, and we concentrated our efforts on the elaboration and development of the vocabulary and terms describing all these positions and aspects, enabling specialists using the same language, so that this idea could be easily understood by the society, by mass media, and so on and so forth. And those documents that are in the process of development will undergo public discussion, and this joint development will enable, formulate the national green concept or green paradigm. Thank you. Yes, Valery Ivanovich, I thank you for raising this topic of green standards in economics and economy, and you have emphasized the plans how to achieve it. Well, I must say that Moscow Department of Natural Resources Management are working to produce KPIs. And dear colleagues, and now I want to give the floor to Paul Zimmerman, the founder and director general, to share his experience in his sphere.
So I don't look Chinese. I am Chinese. I'm a politician in Hong Kong, and I run an NGO that tries to provoke improvements in Hong Kong. And I was asked to bring 3 recommendations from Moscow, and instead of putting them at the end of my speech, maybe I'll bring them at the beginning in terms of how we can get a more sustainable city. First of all, we don't do plastic bottles in Hong Kong. We bring our own, and we refill water. The second thing I could recommend to Russia and to Moscow is be proud of your own food, and don't eat McDonald's and don't eat KFC, because you have all the packaging. Russian food is very nice, and you have fast food for Russian food. And the third thing I want to ask you is when I walk around, is ask people to switch off the engine of their cars when they parked. They're all running their engines, even though it's beautiful weather outside, you're sitting in the cars with the engines on. So the 3 recommendations from Moscow in terms of sustainability. Let me start with that. But let me get to the more serious part of my speech. You're looking confused. I think a basic thing other than energy efficiency is land efficiency. And if I can get the next slide. Thank you. A key things in making sure that it's an efficient use of our land. And the most important thing why we need to do that is because we want to make sure that we safeguard our habitats, our natural land. Now, in Russia, you may say there's not an issue. You got, I believe, 17 million square meters of land. So land may not be an issue for you. But in Moscow, you got about 2,500 square kilometers of land you build on. We got 2,500 square kilometers within the entire territory of Hong Kong. 1,500 is water. Of the 1,000 of land, we only use 24% for our roads and buildings. It's a very high efficient use of our land. And I invite you that is actually a good thing. May I have the next slide? It's a good thing because under the UN Convention on Biodiversity, we want to make sure that we reduce the losses of habitats. We want to stop eating up natural land. We want to stop using up our habitats. And by being focused on not using new land to build on and to grow the cities, but to increase density, we can build better cities and we have less land. We're going to have the next one. So the tale of Hong Kong is a city of 2 extremes. Next one. We got this beautiful wilderness. 40% of our city is wilderness. Next slide. Old villages. Next slide. Beautiful white sand beaches right in our city. 20 minutes, 15 minutes from the main metropolitan areas. Next slides. It's part of it. This is the topography. Steep mountains and a little bit of flatland. Next one. And what is pink here is concrete. What is green, what's yellow is greenbelt, and what is gray-green is our natural land. So you see, we've built on very little land. Next slide. Which means that we live with hyper-density of 110,000 people per square kilometers. And we're happy with that. It works. Why does it work? I can have 8 meetings in a day. Between 8 o'clock and 6 o'clock, I can have 8 meetings. Because I can get from one meeting room to the next very efficiently. I challenge you to do the same in Moscow. Next slide. So here you see the contrast of our hyperdensity city and the natural environment. Next slide. And this is a close-up, an air shot of what that hyperdensity looks like, but allows us to communicate so efficiently between each other. Next one. It also means that we have a very low car ownership. I challenge you in Moscow, as the economy improves, for you to keep the cars out of the city. This city and your city is not designed for a carless city. You have so many suburbs, growing so many people, they're all going to be in vehicles. You have to really think about how you're going to keep the cars out of the city. The car ownership is going to go through the roof in this part of the world, and it's not good for the city. It's a key challenge that I think Moscow should address. Next slide. We have a very short road network, and despite that, we have lots of cars. Next one. And we have we have more public transport vehicles per kilometer road than any city in the world. Because we've got a very short road network, we've got a lot of buses, we've got a lot of taxis, we've got a lot of minibuses. Next one. But despite that, our car ownership is increasing. Next one. But Hong Kong is part of the Pearl River Delta, and you know the story of Hong Kong. It used to be with the UK, now it's part of China. The city that we are becoming part of is the Pearl River Delta, 100 million people, 40,000 square kilometers, and this is the one city we're building. So the question for us, the challenge for us is, how are we going to keep the cars out of our city? Next one. And so how do we keep people happy to live in a hyperdensity city? Next one. So one, we have a big project as environmentalists is to improve the pedestrian environment. Next one. So this is the green streets, the green grids, where you can walk in central. The red roads, the ones you can't cross. Next one. Unlike Moscow, where you put people underground to pass the road, in Hong Kong we put people over the road. So the blue areas here is where you can walk in the second layer of the city, the upper layer of the city. And this is what makes Hong Kong function extremely well. We have two layers. You can walk at street level and you can walk at elevated level. So we double up on our capacity for pedestrians. Next one. This is some of the footbridges that connect through the shopping malls, through the upper level spaces. Next one. And then we're trying to fight within the street level for more pedestrian space, more like you already have, but our streets are narrow, yours are wide. Next one. Next one. And next one, and the final one, next slide. The next thing that we try to do to save our habitat is to get the new developments to focus on recycling old land, existing brownfield sites. Very difficult. The politicians hate it because you've got to deal with the landowner, with the land user, and there's a lot of pollution in the ground. But it's most important not to touch the green fields. Use the brown fields. Force the politicians to fight with the owners. Make sure they use this land and not the new land. This is a key strategy in making sure we safeguard our habitats. Thank you. 7 minutes.
Большое спасибо.
Thanks a lot, Paul. The presentation was great. Well, we studied your experience well, and we are reducing the space for cars. And the people living in Moscow are seeing it every day, but nevertheless, more and more should be done to push the cars out of the city. We were in your city, and we know your approaches about sustainable development, and some of your practices are being implemented in our city also. That brings us to the end of our panel. It's very dynamic. Our forum is 2 days long. We have a lot of round tables. I announce that we'll have the next panel of urban development here in 15 minutes time. And I invite you also to whole Moscow to the panel, live to really live or to sim well. And the topic is concurrent with the economy of sustainable development and synonymical, and ecological sphere penetrates into all spheres of urban life, and like urban development, it's a matter of concern of every aspect. Thank you to all speakers, and we will meet in Moscow hall in 15 minutes time. And I hope that our guest from New Zealand was bold enough to fly to Moscow. Well, because I did not feel comfortable during the flight to New Zealand and back. Thank you.